Good morning, everybody, and welcome from the United Nations. I'm Laura Trevelyan of the BBC, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this morning's proceedings. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. This is a high-level meeting with heads of state and government on the incredibly important issue of the international debt architecture and liquidity. It might sound arcane, but it absolutely is not. It's convened by the Prime Minister of Canada, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and the Secretary-General of the United Nations. I don't need to tell any of you about the havoc that the COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked around the world. Here in New York City, we were briefly the epicenter of that pandemic, and almost exactly a year ago, the soundtrack of our city was that of ambulances. We saw mobile morgues on the corners. We lost more than 30,000 people. But this has happened in so many other places around the world. Now, here in America, we're fortunate. We've had numerous stimulus packages. Economies are beginning to pick up again, but a large, dark cloud remains on the horizon, and that is the growing threat of a global debt crisis that could jeopardize the prospects of a fragile recovery and make it incredibly unequal. The pandemic has already been unequal in its impacts, and this could get even worse. The international community has taken steps to address this problem through an unprecedented fiscal response and the G20's Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, and the Common Framework for Debt Treatment. But is this enough to avert the looming crisis? That's what we will discuss today. Let's hear first from the co-conveners of the meeting, and if I could just make a polite moderator's note that all of you have 3 minutes to speak, and if you could stick to that, that would be terrific. I now would like to invite His Excellency António Guterres, Secretary-General of the United Nations, to deliver his opening remarks. Secretary-General.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. We are at a turning point in the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has cost over 2.7 million lives. More than 120 million people have fallen into extreme poverty. We are in the worst recession since the Great Depression. Richer countries have benefited from an unprecedented $16 trillion of emergency support measures, preventing a downward spiral and setting the stage for recovery. But many developing countries cannot invest in recovery and resilience because of financing constraints. The least developed countries have spent 580 times less in per capita terms on their COVID-19 response than advanced economies. This division is starkly reflected in global access to vaccines. Many developed countries are on the brink of mass vaccination. In developing countries, this could take months, if not years, further delaying a global recovery. We face the specter of a divided world and a lost decade for development. Excellencies, we are on the verge of a debt crisis. Today's meeting, convened with our partners, the Prime Minister of Canada and Jamaica, is a call for urgent action. 6 countries have already defaulted. 1/3 of emerging market economies are at high risk of fiscal crisis. And the situation is even worse for least developed and low-income countries. They face a painfully slow recovery that will put the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement completely out of reach. Developing countries need access to additional liquidity to respond to the pandemic and to invest in recovery. And the global community must urgently provide the necessary support to all developing countries in need. I am encouraged to see that our insistence on the necessity for a new allocation of special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund and the reallocation of unused SDRs to support vulnerable countries, including middle-income ones, is now winning widespread acceptance. Let's make sure it happens and is properly managed to the benefit of the developing world. Excellencies, from the start of the pandemic, we have advocated for a 3-phase approach to debt. First, a moratorium on debt payments. Second, targeted debt relief. Third, reforms to the international debt architecture. I welcome the steps that have been taken, including fresh financing by international financial institutions, the G20's Debt Service Suspension Initiative, and the Common Framework for Debt Treatments. But they are far from enough. I'm therefore calling for much bolder and more ambitious measures. We strongly believe that the Debt Service Suspension Initiative must be extended into 2022 and made also available to highly indebted, vulnerable middle-income countries that request it. The common framework for debt treatments is facing difficulties. Countries are reluctant to use it because they are concerned that it will have a negative impact on their credit rating. We need joint efforts to address these. Additional target debt relief to vulnerable countries, including middle-income ones, will ultimately be needed. A new debt mechanism could provide a menu of options, including debt swaps, buybacks, and cancellations. This is also the moment to tackle long-standing weaknesses in international debt architecture, from lack of agreed principles to restructurings that provide too little relief too late. Excellencies, ultimately, we need a shift in mindsets towards responsible borrowing and lending, accepted by debtor and creditor countries, investors, market participants, credit rating agencies, and international organizations. We need a time-bound open dialogue to build trust and transparency in a systemic and inclusive way. Together, with collective resolve, we can help all countries invest in response, recovery, and a more sustainable and resilient future. Thank you.
Secretary-General, thank you very much, and thank you for reminding us, of course, that there is also inequality in access to vaccines around the world, and we see here in America where we have millions of doses arriving. I now would like to invite Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, one of the co-conveners of this meeting, to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde et merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. J'aimerais aussi remercier le secrétaire général Guterres et le Premier ministre Holness de tenir cet événement avec moi. At our last meeting for this initiative, I remember saying that our world was at a crossroads because what was clear then and what has only become clearer in the months since is that this pandemic has laid bare gaps and inequalities in our economies and our societies. The global economy has now seen its worst recession in 90 years. Tens of millions of people have fallen back into extreme poverty, and hundreds of millions more are likely to fall even deeper into hunger. Add to this the crisis of climate change, which only exacerbates economic challenges, especially for small island economies like our friends in the Caribbean, and we are facing a true watershed moment. Pour avancer, on doit travailler tous ensemble. Mais bien entendu, on doit d'abord s'assurer que tout le monde a un accès à un vaccin sûr et efficace. Le Canada s'est engagé à le faire, que ce soit grâce au partenariat de l'accélérateur ACT ou au mécanisme COVAX. Notre plus grande priorité doit être de vacciner le plus de gens possible, le plus rapidement possible. Et en même temps, il faut se rappeler que cette pandémie n'est pas seulement une crise sanitaire. This pandemic has had a dramatic and uneven economic impact. It has made worse existing financial challenges while threatening economic progress in countries that were otherwise on a sustainable path. I look forward to continuing to discuss how we can work together on these issues. In particular, I know we'll talk about addressing global liquidity constraints, extending and expanding debt service, exploring larger reforms on debt relief, and considering updated eligibility for international assistance. We must rebuild economic systems that can tackle global challenges like extreme poverty, rising inequality, and the existential threat of climate change. In other words, we must translate the commitment to build back better into real action that makes a real difference in people's lives, no matter where they live. Au cours de la dernière année, on a eu d'importantes conversations au sujet de notre relance. Aujourd'hui, on a l'occasion de poursuivre cet effort. Le Canada est là pour écouter et pour agir. Et lors des prochains grands sommets internationaux, on sera prêt à promouvoir encore une fois une réponse mondiale plus efficace et plus concertée. Merci. J'ai bien hâte d'entamer la réunion. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you very much to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And now I'd like to introduce Prime Minister Andrew Holness of Jamaica, also co-convening this meeting, his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Just over a year since the onset of the pandemic, vaccine rollouts are gathering pace. However, we're greatly concerned that many developing countries lack access to regular and sufficient quantities to vaccinate their populations in time. An uneven and unequitable global vaccination program will lead to an uneven global recovery and, sadly, a reinforcement of poverty. Given the interconnected and recurrent impact of the pandemic on all societies and economies globally, unless we are prepared to enter deeper cooperation with fairer, smarter, and broader views of our world and common interests, we should temper our expectations that the crisis is nearing its end. There are some positive indications, however, and we can harness those and build them out in order to get better results if we are rational about what truly needs to be done. For example, there are those who point to the fact that developing countries have, by and large, been able to meet their debt service commitments. And it is true. However, debt servicing has come at tremendous socioeconomic costs to our populations, which have borne the burden of steep cuts in public expenditures. Extreme fiscal contractions are having a dramatic impact on the ability of developing countries to meet their sustainable development and climate action commitments. For developing countries designated as middle income, and particularly for small island developing states, the pandemic has exposed developmental vulnerabilities which make the designation as middle income a largely arbitrary and unhelpful designation in crafting a fair global response. Aside from pre-existing fiscal weaknesses, other structural vulnerabilities, such as over-reliance on one industry, for example, tourism for revenues, or lack of adequate broadband infrastructure to support the transition to virtual economies and to support education, severely limits the response of actions of developing countries and will inevitably force them to increase their borrowing, which exacerbates already high debt service burdens. Against this backdrop, developing countries require a combination of debt relief and a major injection of liquidity. I'm encouraged, therefore, by the views of the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who has said that a new allocation of special drawing rights could improve the health and economic recovery efforts of developing countries and prevent them from falling into insolvency. It would be helpful if a new issuance were combined with a voluntary reallocation of excess SDRs provided by countries with strong external positions to those that need them the most. Another encouraging development has been the extension by the G20 of its debt service suspension initiative, the DSSI, to the end of this year. I believe there is a sound basis for it to be further extended to next year. Consideration should also be given to expanding its beneficiaries to include highly indebted middle-income countries. Now, private creditors represent an increasingly large share of the overall creditor composition of developing countries and should be actively pursued and engaged to participate in the DSSI on equal terms. However, we need to bring the credit rating agencies into our discussions, as many countries are afraid to apply for debt relief because of the threat of a ratings downgrade. A special framework applicable only to this extraordinary period is more than worthy of their contemplation, given the larger medium-term cumulative benefit of more countries achieving earlier recovery with sustainable debt arrangements. The utilization of innovative financial instruments such as debt swaps, contingent debt instruments, and the creation of specialized liquidity funds can also play an important role in ameliorating the debt and liquidity challenges of developing countries. In this respect, we support the proposal by ECLAC to address the liquidity needs of Caribbean countries through the creation of a Caribbean Resilience Fund. There's also proposed a debt for climate adaptation swap facility. Also of interest is Costa Rica's proposal for the creation of an extraordinary support fund to alleviate the effects of COVID-19 economics. This fund will be geared to addressing the impacts of COVID-19 and the fiscal space of countries and assist them in fulfilling their external debt obligations. These initiatives merit serious consideration, especially for Caribbean small island developing states, given our vulnerability to climate change and dependence on external capital flows from tourism and remittances. Another issue we should address is the need to establish a sovereign debt architecture mechanism that provides a framework for orderly and effective debt restructuring. The effort to reform the international debt architecture will require that we adopt a systemic approach, one that aligns with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Excellencies, with the collective will of the international community, we can successfully overcome these challenges and place ourselves on a more sustainable and resilient path over the years to come. The extraordinary nature of these times demands different thinking and action from us all. An effective, variable, and scalable response is possible and can lead to faster, stronger, and more resilient recoveries. Let's get it done.